Had to make sure I had the order correct there. Sir? I only need to be told about 4 or 5 times, and I'll get it. And how long do I have? Till about 1:45? It's a good guess, right? Okay, good. Well, it is good to be here with everybody this evening. Glad to see you again. Always a joy to come back here and be with you. My wife was a little under the weather this afternoon, so she wasn't able to come, but I know she would have enjoyed being here. You know, when you're last in a race, they call you the anchor person. And if you're the anchor in a race, that means you're the fastest one. You're the top dog. But if you're an anchor on a boat, you're the thing that weighs everybody else down. So I'll let you decide if I'm in the boating world or the racing world. How about that? But I know you've had some great speakers this year, and so it's an honor and privilege, and thanks to the elders for letting me come to speak to you this evening. This is the second time I've spoken on wisdom this summer. I spoke at the Macklin Road congregation on the subject of wisdom. And I had actually started outlining this book probably, I guess, last year sometime and finished writing it back in May. So it would all worked out well, didn't it? But it's a great topic, and I'm sure that you have been spending time in the book of Proverbs throughout this summer series, and that's exactly what I intend for us to do as well. So we'll be looking at Proverbs as the primary passages to support our points this evening, and then we're going to look at other passages as well. Wisdom and friendship. The term friend is used not a few times in the Scriptures, and it's used a number of times in the book of Proverbs. And we'll talk about those this evening. And again, I think I've got about 9 or 10 points that I want to make. We're not going to cover every one of them, but I think we're going to cover a pretty good bit of this as well. Everybody likes to have friends. Friends encourage us. Friends strengthen us. Everybody's probably got a best friend. It could be your spouse. It could be the person down the street. It could be somebody you've known for years from childhood. So we love to have friends. So let's talk about some of what the Proverbs say about friendship this evening. Well, I thought I was going to do that. Let me see. There we go. All right, the first point we want to bring out from the Scriptures is that we do need to choose friends wisely. Look with me in Proverbs chapter 1. And the first 10 chapters of Proverbs are kind of an overview of what's to come from chapter 11 through chapter 31. If you have a version of the Bible, usually a King James version that has headings at the top, they may say something beginning in chapter 10, they may say something like this, moral virtues and contrary vices. From chapter 10 through chapter 30 especially, Proverbs is made up of just brief, pithy statements, of course, given by divine inspiration. But the first 9 chapters of Proverbs are taken up with the father, Solomon, addressing one of his sons, at least one of his sons. And the topic of wisdom is introduced throughout those 9 chapters. Beginning in chapter 1, and you've already discussed in a previous lesson this summer about the fact that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In verse 10, in regard to this point about choosing friends wisely, he said, "My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. If they say, 'Come with us, let us lay wait for blood, let us lurk privily for the innocent without cause, let us swallow them up alive as the grave, and whole as those that go down into the pit. We shall find all precious substance, we shall fill our houses with spoil. Cast in thy lot among us, let us all have one purse. My son, walk not thou in the way with them, refrain thy foot from their path, for their feet run to evil, and make haste to shed blood. Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird, and they lay wait for their own blood, they lurk privily for their own lives. So are the ways of every one that is greedy of gain, which taketh away the life of the owners thereof." As you go on, he's going to talk to him about being careful about his association with women. And who knew better than Solomon about poor association with women. But here in chapter 1, he's talking about if any of your companions come to you and say, let's go do something, and this is going to be fun, and it's going to be rewarding to us, and basically what they're trying to get him to do is to go out and hurt somebody, and to cheat somebody, and to rob from somebody. And they're going to talk about all the great benefit that they get from it. Solomon said, if they approach you about this, go the other way. You know, we're not just to turn from evil, but Paul told Timothy that we are to flee from evil. We should be like Joseph was when we read in Genesis 38, 39, and 40 about how he was in the household of Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. And the Bible says that Joseph ran away so quickly that the coat was torn off of him. That's the way that we need to deal with this. And so we like to think sometimes, and 1 Corinthians 15:33 says that evil associations corrupt good morals, and we know that's true. We like to think sometimes that we're so strong and that what somebody else is or how somebody else asks won't affect us, so that we can go ahead and go along with them, that it's not going to bother us. How well I remember being in college, and my roommate during the summer session came back to the dorm room one evening, and he had gone with one of our professors to the professor's high school reunion. And while they were there, the high school was a public school apparently, and they were having a dance at the reunion. And our mutual professor was dancing with his high school sweetheart. Now, this man was a married man, but he was dancing with his high school sweetheart. And on the way home, my roommate said to him, you know, I'm really concerned about you having done that. And the professor said, well, but those things don't bother me. I'm not bothered by things like that. He was saying, I can go ahead and fall in with my friends in doing things like that because it doesn't cause me to have sinful thoughts. Interestingly enough, before they got back home, the professor had said to my roommate, you know, I could have had a fling with that woman tonight if I'd wanted to. Now let me ask you a question. If that didn't bother him, then why did that even come to his mind? But you see, he thought he was stronger than that. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Now, the opposite of this is the fact that we, while we should choose our friends wisely, still need to be an influence on those who are in the world, do we not? Jesus said in Matthew 5:13 through 16 that we're to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where he was rebuking the church there in Corinth because they had done nothing about the brother who had his father's wife, he told them that you are to mark and withdraw from or not associate with any who is a brother who is called a fornicator or a reviler or an extortioner. But he said, as far as being in the world, you can't completely pull yourself away from the world. Because then he said you would have to go out of the world. So there's a bit of a balance here, isn't there? On one hand, we need to choose our friends wisely and not run with those who are into evil. But on the other hand, if we're not the salt of the earth for them, who is going to be? How are they going to see Christ in the life of a Christian if we don't show that light to them? It requires wisdom, since we're talking about wisdom. It requires wisdom. But you know what it doesn't require? It doesn't require that we go along with them. Not long ago, I'm sad to say this, but I had a conversation with a deacon in the Lord's church. Not in this area, this is in another state. But he said he felt like, and I had noticed that he had begun drinking. And I asked him why. And he said, well, as I was trying to influence people in the community, I noticed that they were more relaxed if I had a can of beer in my hand. And I said, you can't go and live on somebody else's level and bring them up to Christ's level. You just can't do it. So choosing our friends wisely, as we'll see when we make a later point later, we should be seeking to do what we can to lead them closer to Christ. And if they are going away from Christ and they're not listening to us, that's when we need to say, you know, I love you, you're my friend, but I can't participate in these things with you. That's exactly what Solomon was telling his son. Choose your friends wisely. Be careful about your associations because, again, 1 Corinthians 15:33, they can cause problems for us. I remember a young man who was a member of the church, and he was out riding with some friends one evening. This happened probably about 20 years ago, and he was in his late teens at the time. He was out riding with his friends. At least he thought they were his friends. None of them were members of the church. He was just hanging out with his friends, and he seemed like he was a good young man, that he wasn't into anything illegal or immoral, but he was hanging out with the wrong people. And as he was riding in the back seat with another of his friends in the passenger side in the front, and another of his friends driving, apparently the one who was driving got upset with somebody who was driving in the lane next to them, decided he'd pull out a gun and shoot him. Well, that young man was in the car, even though he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. He was in the car when the gun was fired and the man was murdered. You see, again, we need to choose our friends wisely. If I spend as much time on all these as this one, we won't be home till midnight. But I think it's important we understand that. Let's talk about this one. Proverbs 18 and verse 24. Proverbs 18 and verse 24. The King James Version says, "A man that hath friends must show himself friendly, and there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother." Now, we're going to talk about another version here in just a moment, because yours, if you don't have a King James, may read quite differently from that. There is a text, what's called a textual variant here. You have different manuscripts that are giving different words as opposed to this one. There is not a conclusive decision that I have seen among commentators and scholars as to which one is the preferred. So we're going to look at it from both perspectives. But from this perspective, he says to show yourself friendly. And you see I've got the one-way sign up there. Have you? Don't answer this, okay? You don't even have to do this or this. Just in your head, answer it. Have you ever been in a one-way friendship where you felt like maybe you were the one who was doing all the giving and that friend was doing all the taking? Well, let's take another application of that. The one-way street is the individual, as he says, must show himself or herself friendly, the individual who expects everybody to do things for them, but they won't put forth the effort themselves. If we're going to have friends, we must show ourselves to be friendly individuals. We can't walk around like this all the time and expect people to shine to us, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe this is comfortable for you to do this. If you're going to do like that, maybe you ought to loosen it up just a little bit. Maybe do some Jack Benny or something like that. But if you're walking around like this the whole time and you got the sour look on your face and you look like you just eaten a sour apple or something like that. Charles Spurgeon said one time, he was teaching a bunch of young preachers. He said, "Gentlemen, when you're preaching about heaven, let your face light up like the glory from above." And he said, and when you're preaching about hell, well, then your everyday face will do just fine. So we don't want to be like that. We want to show ourselves friendly. We want to be inviting to people. Now, there are a lot of applications you can make with this, right? Let's just talk about even assembling together with the church. Y'all like to have visitors, don't you? Visitors come in and they come in the back door and they don't, maybe they're here for the very first time. You know, maybe they've never even assembled with the Church of Christ before. This is their first impression. What kind of impression do they leave with? We want them to be our friends. We want them to have their hearts and minds open to the preaching of the gospel. So what do we need to do? What do we do? When they come in the door, we turn our backs on them. I know you don't do that, and I'm appreciative of that. Our attitude instead should be that we're so excited that you're here. We're so glad you're here. They ought to leave this place feeling like they have never been treated like this ever in their whole lives as far as a positive response that they got. I've got a quote, the mention here of John 13:34 and 35, where Jesus was addressing his disciples, and he said, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one to another." Now that is a two-way street. One another, and think about all the many one another passages in the New Testament. Those are reciprocal instructions. I exhort you, you exhort me. I show kindness to you, you show kindness to me. I love you, and you show love to me. We must carry out or go on a two-way street when it comes to being friendly. Show yourself friendly. And I know some people are shy. And maybe some people are afraid, well, if I stick my hand out and shake that person's hand, they might not want to shake my hand. Or I might say something to them and they might be rude back to me. Well, that's not your fault. Take a chance. You know, every one of us who's married is taking a chance. Right? Somebody stuck their neck out. Somebody decided, I'm going to ask her out. Or she might have said, I'm going to ask him out. Or he might have said, I'm going to ask her to marry me. Or she might have said, I'm going to ask him to marry me, whichever the case may be. But somebody had to stick their neck out. Well, we need to do the same thing. What's the worst that's going to happen? When you try to show yourself friendly to somebody, what's the worst that's going to happen? I don't think they're going to pull out a gun and shoot you. The worst that might happen is they might turn their back on you and decide they don't want to be friends with you. So what have you lost? Well, you've had a great attitude and you've tried to show somebody the kindness of Christ. So let's look at the other rendering of that passage. This is from the New American Standard. And again, there are others that translate it even a little bit differently than this. But in the New American Standard, it says, "A man of too many friends comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother." And I know some people say, well, you can never have too many friends. But in this context, looking at the way this particular series of words is translated, he seems to be suggesting that, yes, they can be detrimental to you if they are not well chosen. But I wanted to focus on the latter part of this because it's the same. The first part of the verse is different depending on the manuscripts that are chosen. But the latter part is the same. There is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. The reference I have is the 2 Samuel 1 and verse 26. And that is David, who is speaking on the event of the death of his beloved friend Jonathan. You know, he said the love of Jonathan was better to him than the love of women. And it's sad that those who are proponents of homosexuality have taken that and suggested that David was a homosexual, that Jonathan was a homosexual. In fact, if you look at the context and you look at the whole life of David, a man who, by the way, was called a man after God's own heart, and if you look at the trouble David had with ladies and the trouble that with his wife Michal and with Bathsheba and with others, you find that David is saying, I have never had a truer friend than you, even among women, Jonathan. But again, we're familiar with the relationship between David and Jonathan, how close they were to each other. It was Jonathan, remember, who was willing to sacrifice his place on the throne so that David's life would be protected. In fact, his own father, Saul, ended up trying to kill him because he was trying to protect his good friend David. There is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. We can have a lot of friends, as he says in the first part of this. There might be many friends, but don't we all have some who are closer than others? Even Jesus did he not? You think of Peter, James, and John, who went kind of into the inner realm with Jesus there, especially in the Garden of Gethsemane. Let's look at another passage. This point, next one being, be a friend just because. Let's look in Proverbs 14 and verse 20. Proverbs 14 and verse 20 says, the poor is hated even of his own neighbor, but the rich has many friends. Now you probably know where I'm going with this, but let's keep going. Chapter 19 and verse 4 says, wealth maketh many friends, but the poor is separated from his neighbor. Chapter 19 and verse 6, many will entreat the favor of the prince, and every man is a friend to him that giveth gifts. Verse 7, all the brethren of the poor do hate him. how much more do his friends go far from him? He pursueth them with words, yet they are wanting to him. In those 4 verses, we see those who are wanting to be friends with people who would give them something. The prince has many friends. Why does the prince have so many friends? Because the prince has money. Because the prince has influence. Because the prince has power. So I want to be his friend. You ever see that happen? I've been in business networking meetings, and I've had business people I've worked with tell me they've been to business networking meetings, and you have a room full of people in there, and here is this person talking to this person here. Person number A owns a small business. Person letter B owns maybe a little bit bigger business. But then here comes person number C, and he or she is the CEO of a major corporation. All of a sudden, person B says, excuse me, I got to go. Or maybe isn't even that polite and just turns and goes the other way. Because they see somebody there who can help them in business. And to some extent, that's fine. But being rude or unfriendly to somebody who can't do anything for you is not what is acceptable in the eyes of God. That's what he's talking about here. He said the poor person doesn't attract all those people because all those people, as he's the ones he's talking about, are seeing what they can get. The reference I have here, the second reference I have is in Luke 14, 7 through 14. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus went into the home of a Pharisee to eat a meal. While he was there, he noticed that the people who were coming in were choosing the best seats in the house. You see, the way it was set up for a meal in that time is the honored guests, the honorees would be put up front, and then everybody else would find their place on the side or in the back. And Jesus noticed how when people were walking in, the first place they were going was to the very front. And the reason they did that is because they assumed, who else is going to be honored except for me? I deserve the honor, so I should be in the front seat. And of course, Jesus told them, when you go into a place, of course, don't practice false humility. If you're supposed to be up there, go up there. But he said, if you go into a place, go take the lowest seat first. And then if they come to you and say, here, you're supposed to be sitting up here with us, then that's fine. But he said, if you go take the highest place and they say, get out of here, you don't belong up here, he said, then you're going to be shamed. But after he says that, in chapter 14, verses 7 through 14, he talks about reaching out to those who are poor. He said, invite those, basically, who can't do anything for you to come and eat with you. The ones who can't invite you to their house because they don't have enough money to feed themselves and you as well. They can't give you anything. They can't give you any position. They can't give you any power because, again, these folks who were going to that Pharisee's house were there because they wanted to be seen and they wanted to associate with the power so they could get some themselves. Jesus said, when you go out, just go ask somebody to come and join you just because you just want to be their friend. It's a great principle, isn't it? Is it right for us to be determining our friendships based on what we can get out of somebody else? That's back to that one-way street kind of thing, isn't it? Instead, it should be all about what we can give as Christians to one another. How about this one? Be careful in business. Watch out now. He's going to get personal. He's going to start meddling. So let's go back to Proverbs chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, because the writer deals with this. Proverbs 6, verses 1 through 5. He said, my son, if thou be surety for thy friend, if thou hast stricken thy hand with a stranger, thou art snared with the words of thy mouth, thou art taken with the words of thy mouth. Do this now, my son, and deliver thyself when thou art come into the hand of thy friend. Go humble thyself and make sure thy friend. Give not sleep to thy eyes or slumber to thy eyelids. Deliver thyself as a roe from the hand of the hunter, as a bird from the hand of the fowler. What he's talking about here is an individual, and he's talking to his son, who basically has gotten into a bad business relationship. He says, if you're surety for your friend, basically he's become like a co-signer for his friend. And he's done it very unwisely. And he said, son, if you've done that, don't waste any time, don't get any sleep. Do like, as he says in verse 5, the deer who's running away from the hunter. Get there, get out of it, move on. We need to be careful in our business relationships. Well, some of you might have had these experiences too, but I've been around long enough to tell you, it seems like I've seen as many problems, even among Christians, over money as anything else. And it's sad. You know, sometimes we have problems because brothers and sisters are gone off into error, doctrinal error. Sometimes there are those who have changed their personalities and they're not agreeable anymore, and so they decide that they don't want to be a part of the congregation, and so there's a problem caused by them as well. But sometimes it's a money thing. Sometimes people have disagreements over that. He said, be careful. Yes, even with brothers and sisters in Christ, be careful in business, he said. And he uses the term friend specifically. Just because that's your friend doesn't necessarily mean that you should be doing business with them. Does everybody get that one? That's pretty plain. It's pretty straightforward. And this from a man who was the wealthiest man on the face of the earth. Matthew 25:14 through 30 talks about our need to be good stewards. Talks about the men with the different talents and how their master, when he came back, expected them to have used their talents. How about this one? Keep your confidences. Proverbs 16 and verse 28. Proverbs 16 verse 28 says, a froward man soweth strife, and a whisperer, that is a gossip, separateth chief friends. Chapter 17 and verse 9. He that covereth the transgression seeketh love, but he that repeateth the matter separateth very friends. I started to put this in the negative, and I thought, now let me just stay with positive statements here. But if we were to put this in a negative, we might say, here's the best way to destroy a friendship. Reveal confidences. Break your word. When you've told somebody that they could confide in you and that you would keep it between you and them, if you want to destroy a friendship, break that word. But if you want to keep that friendship, if somebody says, I need to talk to somebody, I need to talk to you about my home situation, I need to talk to you about my job situation, I need to talk to you about something that's happening at church, I just need somebody to talk to, but I need you to keep it between us. These verses say a true friend is going to do that. A wise individual is going to keep their own confidence. In fact, Proverbs 26, verses 20 through 22, a similar passage, says, where no wood is, the fire goeth out. So where there is no talebearer, the strife ceaseth. As coals are to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. The words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. We hurt people with our gossip. We hurt the individual about whom the gossip is said. We hurt the individual who is our friend, who we might have made a commitment to, that we're going to keep it between them and us. Keep your confidences. If something is about to be said to you that is just way too juicy for you to keep to yourself, then please, let's all of us, myself included, have the strength and the courage to say to that person, you know, I really don't feel like you should be telling this to me. Keep your confidences. About this one, be consistent. Chapter 17 and verse 17. Brother Tommy, do you want me to go right into the invitation when I'm finished with this? Okay. Okay, so I've got about 4 or 5 minutes then, correct? About quarter till? Okay. All right, Proverbs 17 and verse 17. It says, a friend loveth at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Be consistent. You've heard of fair weather friends? Fair weather friends are foul. Fair weather friends are the ones who are with you by your side when things are going great, but abandon you when you start having trouble. He says, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. In other words, there's somebody who's going to be there for you. A couple of supporting passages, Philippians 2:19 through 22, Philippians 4:14 through 16. In Philippians 2, we read about Timothy. Paul said about Timothy, he said, I have no one who's like-minded like Timothy. I have no friend, no brother like Timothy has been to me. And you think about all that Paul has been through, and we don't have time to list all those things. You think about all the trials that Paul went through, but Timothy stood with him. In Philippians 4:14 through 16, he talked to those Philippian brethren about the fact that time and time and time again, they kept helping him. When other congregations, such as the Corinthians, were not helping him and were actually arguing and fighting against him, the Philippians, time and time again, along with the Thessalonian brethren, they kept being there to help him. A good friend is one who is there in good times and bad. In fact, that good friend is the one when times go bad, the one you know is going to be there for you. They're not going to run out on you. They're going to be by your side. That's the kind of friend we want to be to others. Be honest. Proverbs 27 and verse 6 says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. So the kisses of the enemy is the one who really doesn't like you but plays up to you. That's deceitful. But the first part of the verse is that the wounds of a friend are faithful, because the friend is going to be honest with you. And the friend is going to point out if something needs to be corrected within you. They're going to be honest enough to say something. Yes, it's still a wound. It still hurts. None of us likes to be corrected. But nonetheless, because we know the source of that and we know that person loves us, we're more ready to accept that. We've got Colossians 3 and verse 9 where it says to lie not one to another. And James 5 and verse 12 that says that our speech should be yes and no. That we should be people of such honesty that we don't need to constantly be calling on God as an oath for telling the truth. But we want to be honest with each other. And you know what else? Let me throw this in here too. Being honest with each other as friends, not so that we can get it off our chest and feel better about it. You know, if our purpose in correcting a friend, being honest with a friend who needs to be corrected, if our purpose in that is to get it out of our system, we've got the wrong purpose. Our purpose should always be to lead a soul to Christ. Our purpose should always be, I'm doing this out of love for you and for your soul. Be honest with each other. Be considerate. Proverbs 25, verse 17. Says, withdraw thy foot from thy neighbor's house, lest he be weary of thee and so hate thee. In other words, when it's midnight, go home. Isn't it better when you're visiting a friend, isn't it better for them to say, oh, do you have to go so soon? Than for them to say, good night, we're going to bed. You stay up as long as you want, but we're going to bed. And then chapter 27 and verse 14. He that blesseth his friend with a loud voice rising early in the morning, it shall be counted a curse to him. That's a very unusual passage. But what he seems to be saying here is an individual who, under the guise of a friend, is actually agitating his friend. He's getting up in the morning, he's making all kinds of noise, waking his friend up, waking up his neighbor. He's not being considerate of it. Philippians 2, verses 1 through 8, I'll leave that for your personal study, that we are to have the mind of Christ, that we're to think of others first. That's being considerate as a friend. Help your friends be better. Proverbs 27 and verse 17 says, iron sharpeneth iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friends. We ought to be trying to make our friends better. If we're a real friend to somebody, we ought to be striving to help them be better. Not that we're acting better, not that we're acting superior to them in any way, but just that we're making people stronger. I've told young folks this, and old folks too, and I had to learn it myself. But a relationship whether it is a friend, a guy friend, guys, a lady friend, ladies, or a boyfriend, girlfriend situation. A relationship that's pulling you away from God is not a good friendship. And it doesn't bode well for the future. And I like to especially bring that up to the folks who are not married, not just young folks, but us older folks who have gone through a time in our lives when we were not married. A relationship is not good if that person is drawing you away from God, or if you're drawing them away from God. Iron sharpens iron, so the friend sharpens the countenance of his friend. We ought to be helping others be closer to God, which leads to the final point. And that is, as friends, we should be leading our friends to the Lord. Proverbs 11 and verse 30 says, "He that winneth souls is wise." Mark 16 and verse 15 literally says, "As you are going into the world, preach the gospel to every creature." The best and greatest thing, or the best and greatest way that I can show friendship to anybody is by showing them Jesus Christ through the Word of God. And the way I'm going to do that is by teaching them the Word, but also I need to be consistent in my life with that Word that I'm teaching. I need to set the example so that others can see the pathway to Christ. If I live a life of ungodliness, then I'm going to throw a shadow on the light of Christ. I want to lead my friends to the Lord as a friend. Which leads to this point. In John 14 and verse 15, as we get ready to conclude, and we'll sing the hymn in just a moment, the hymn which has been selected. But in John 14 and verse 15, Jesus used the word friends. He said, "You are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you." Now that's pretty clear. The contrary is extended to us or pointed out to us. The contrast to that in James 4 and verse 4, where James said, "Whosoever will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God." So we've got a choice tonight. We can be a friend of the Lord, or we can be an enemy of the Lord. The difference between the two is the friend of the Lord, as Jesus said, is the one who is obeying him and following him faithfully. The enemy is the one who has decided to follow the ways of the world. How much clearer can it possibly be than what the Word just presented to us? So tonight, if you want to be a friend of the Lord, which means that you're doing His will, this is a great opportunity, if you're not a Christian, to be obedient to the gospel of Jesus Christ. We want to hear the words of the Lord when we stand before Him in judgment. "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord." Tonight, if you're not a Christian, do you believe that Jesus is Christ, the Son of God? Jesus said you must in John 8 and verse 24, "You'll die in your sins."